Thank you, Andrew. And welcome everyone. Hope you're enjoying the start to your week and enjoying the wonderful weather. Today we're going to continue our Earth Week activities with a webinar on resilience and flood mitigation efforts. And joining us today to talk about this topic is Lucas Hernandez. Lucas is the resilience specialist for the Kiawah Island Community Association and has been for about 2 years. In this position, he serves as the special assistant to the chief operating officer, with the focus on coordination and integration of the community's various strategies to address sea level rise, flooding, and other environmental issues that challenge the quality of life and sustainable living on Kiawah Island. For his employment, he worked on a grant with the Town of Kiawah Island to develop a series of flood models for storm surge, sea level rise, and rainfall. These models were later incorporated into the town's flood mitigation and sea level rise adaptation report and projects to the KICA's water management task force. He is now working on developing Kiawah's resilience plan in collaboration with the Town of Kiawah Island and coordinating with the Conservancy and their grant through the Emergency Coastal Resilience Fund. Without further ado, here's Lucas to talk to us about flooding.
Thank you, Lee. Let's see, let me go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see that? All righty. Go into presentation. Okay, so thank you again, Lee. And I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak to you all today. I was actually asked a couple weeks ago if I would be willing to speak through the Earth Week. And the topic that I was presented was flood mitigation and stormwater management. And when I was going through and thinking of ideas to bring to this presentation, I think there was a couple obvious ones like the water management task force projects that are currently being worked on around the island. But really, I thought it would be a better idea to go ahead and present almost an update on what we have done as an island in regard to flood mitigation and stormwater management, and how those practices are still tied back to the original flood mitigation and sea level rise adaptation report from the Town of Kiawah Island. So to begin, just a brief overview. I've got a photo here of that report from the town and the sea level rise adaptation subcommittee. The goal of this report was to capitalize on assets, tackle challenges head on, work collaboratively as an island, and then make Kiawah the best adapted and most resilient community that it can be. This project, the folks that were involved in it engaged with neighboring communities, managers, experts, scientists, engineers, and actually I had the opportunity to work on this to a small degree as well before I officially came onto the island. As Lee mentioned, I did have a grant when I was at the College of Charleston to create a series of flood maps for the island, various levels of storm surge, different sea level rise predictions for the island, and then rainfall maps as well. And the goal of that project was to create a parcel level study to better understand the movement of floodwater on the island and ways that we might mitigate that in the future. It actually became the reason that I met KICA in the first place. This was early on when the flood mitigation projects from the Water Management Task Force had just begun, and I was introduced to them and had the chance to apply that information to their study that's ongoing now. So again, the final point on this report was there was around 130 recommendations that were made by this committee to the Town of Kiawah Island and as a matter of fact to all of the entities on Kiawah Island in order to better the resilience of our community. So with that many recommendations, it sort of behooved me to put together at least some sort of way to track what each entity on the island has been doing. And part of my position at KICA is working collaboratively among the other entities, and introducing new ways that, we use to mitigate flooding, and what we could propose to others to use as well. So this document was later created to just help monitor the island's progress towards that flood mitigation and sea level rise adaptation report's recommendations, to help us better understand how we're progressing as a community and what projects might be next in line to complete. At this point, we're around 40% complete. Well, I say complete, but we've at least addressed 40% of the 130 recommendations that were included in the original report. So as we move forward, I've sort of split each of these sections into where I felt the major projects that have happened recently best fit in. So those sections are infrastructure, planning, and monitoring. So beginning with infrastructure, I think the obvious one here is the KICA's new flood mitigation efforts. So you all may be very well aware of these. These were proposed early or late last year, and we've already completed one of the 6 major projects. The second one is well on the way to be completed. And this was, again, where I was first able to apply those modeling sort of predictions to real-time efforts on the island. And that project took around 7 months to complete, I believe, in total. We worked along with Stantec's engineering firm and several staff members from the Kiawah Island Community Association. So the ultimate ending for that project was 6 key areas that we designated would help to improve the flow of stormwater through the overall system on the island. We had identified pretty early on that there were 2 major choke points towards the center of the island, very, very close to where the old fire station used to be on the Kiawah Island Parkway. So the first project that we completed, I would argue, is probably the most important, and that would be the Pond 30 outfall right there across from where the old fire station used to be, and near to Sora Railroad. That project involved actually creating a whole new watershed. And originally, all of the movement of stormwater from the V gate would have to make its way through our pond system out into the major outfall there by Beachwalker Drive and Inlet Cove. So what we had decided was that it would be much more efficient if we were able to cut that drainage basin in half and essentially route that water into that tidal creek. Now, at times of high tide, that water will still go out the outfall near Beachwalker when the system is wetted. So that was also a major component in this project, was that we wanted to make sure that not only were we able to manage stormwater during a regular storm, but we wanted to make sure that we were still able to keep our roads dry even during a higher tide scenario. Tides are a big driving factor in the ability for our island to move water, and this project was at least the first that I've been aware of that has addressed that issue up front. So the next project, and then there's a little hint towards the 2021 PGA Championship, was the Parkway elevation review. Now, this project came on essentially at the same time, and this is on the town's end. As we were working through with Stantec, Mayor Weaver actually reached out to me and asked if it would be beneficial for me to be part of the planning process for the proposed raising of the Kiawah Island Parkway before the main gate. As that road functions, if that were to be raised, a lot of that water could have made its way towards the main gate itself, and then we transitioned one issue from the town's perspective into one that is now a KICA central issue. So it definitely begged my involvement in that project as well. So when we looked at the road, we took spot elevations, and again, we worked with a different engineering firm for this one. But we actually modeled the different effects of 3 different scenarios of major storms hitting the island. So we took into account king tides alone. So how does the road fare with an average king tide for our island, which is roughly about a 6-foot tide, and then how would that be impacted if we were to add the scenario of a 20-year sea level rise event? So we added another 2.5 feet to that number and looked to see what that road would look like afterward. So with the modeling, we're able to actually see how much water would stand on the road in inches. So actually, Parkway untouched at this point would have withstood nuisance flooding in the next 20 years of sea level rise. And that 20-year number was actually chosen because the life of a road is exactly 20 years. The next storm surge sort of scenario we chose was an actually equivalent to what we saw during Hurricane Irma. So we wanted to understand what a 4.5-foot storm surge would look like if it had made its way across the Parkway. And again, in that scenario, we did see that there was water on the Parkway. However, it was still navigable, which is less than 12 foot for a vehicle. That's around the height of a normal car's tailpipe. And unless you have a snorkel, you can't withstand more water than that on the road at that point. And then our final sort of high level scenario was a combination of that storm surge and sea level rise, which was a 7-foot storm surge. And that ended up being probably a little bit of an overkill for this project, but we wanted to understand all 3 different scenarios. And what was ultimately determined was that the road plus the several inches that it would have gained being resurfaced would have pushed us through the 20-year lifespan of the road. And at that point, it would not make sense to apply an investment when we do not yet have a clear picture of sea level rise as it relates to the island. So which we now will have a better idea about because of one of the projects that I will mention later on. So now we move into planning. The first planning project that actually began again right before my hiring date was a sort of small scale version of the flood mitigation and sea level rise adaptation report for Inlet Cove in particular. So the reason that the Inlet Cove board wanted to dive into this endeavor was the past experience with major storms, of course. And again, they wanted to mirror that report from the town. They were also concerned about their personal safety and protection of their property within the area. So part of this project, again, was developing a set of those flood prediction models specifically for Inlet Cove. We also spoke with a representative from OCRM who would be involved in any permitting that would have to be done in that community. We looked at drainage. We looked at different levels of rainfall amounts in the area, well beyond what the engineering standard is. And overall, that community fares very well. So again, the charge from the board was to review that initial report and identify and evaluate specific vulnerabilities. And there's the list that we had actually went through. And as we ran all these models, we looked at the different infrastructure out there and the assets that the regime owns And we found that for the most part, that community should fare very well. So again, part of that was to look at possible actions, and we did create another list of recommendations that the regime board was presented at their annual meeting for different things that they may take into account in the future. But again, Inlet Cove fares very well in comparison to some other places on the island. The second, and I actually believe one of the members of this task force is in this call right now, is the adaptive management plan for Kiawah Island. So just at the very end of last year, we completed phase 1, which was a threshold identification. And our goal for this report was to solicit views from the community on their values for quality of life on the island. We wanted to look and we wanted to ask to find out which, at what point is quality of life, economic viability, infrastructure, or the aspirations of Kiawah negatively impacted by sea level rise, storm surge, and climate change in general. And again, as with a lot of these documents, there is a component that is education for the community as a whole. So as part of that project, we met early on with virtual focus groups to help identify what quality of life concerns that our community had. It was a goal early on that this report wasn't meant to tell folks on the island what they should be worried about. We wanted to hear from you all what your concerns were so that we could address those later on down the road. So again, community survey was sent out, and actually before the most recent survey from KICA, this was one of the highest levels of responses that we had had. I think there were over 1,500 responses that we had gotten to this survey from the island. And we also spoke with regimes, we spoke with property management companies, we spoke with the different entities on the island. We really wanted to understand what vulnerabilities that everyone involved in the day-to-day on Kiawah were concerned about. And then finally, what this initial phase of the resilience plan led to was the background information that was needed for phase 2, which I do have mentioned later on, but phase 2 is currently my big project at this point in time. And it should be presented in June to the rest of the community, but we actually took the threshold areas that were identified by the community, which were the salt marsh, the beach and the dunes, the roads, access to amenities, and private property. So we took all of those concerns, and I'm now in the mode of speaking with different off-island professionals to see what they feel, OCRM, Department of Natural Resources, entities like that, to see what they feel might be sort of worst case scenarios for those areas of concern, and what might be checkpoints that we could reach to better predict when to apply funding or monitoring to a situation. So again, here's a little bit about the community survey results. There was 1,564 responses. And I believe, again, there is the high level of concern items, which were your utilities. I forgot to mention that previously, road access and amenities. And then also some additional concerns with vegetation, maritime forest, property, and then costs. Obviously, how much does it cost to keep up with what the predictions are for sea level rise and climate change in the future? So the second or the third area here is monitoring. And what I've got pictured here is the recently deployed, well, it's been about a year now, tide gauge at the Keele River Bridge. So many of you coming into the island have probably seen this on the side of the road, and maybe you thought it was a cable box or something or another. I think it blends in pretty well, so maybe you haven't noticed it at all. But this system was put in last May. So this coming May, we will have had exactly a year of data, which is exciting to me anyway, because that gives us a full 4-season view of how our tides fluctuate throughout the year. Recently, we have partnered with the College of Charleston to help host this data to the National Weather Service. So this location is actually sending data to the Weather Service so that they are able to better understand what the conditions on our island are. Before this gauge was put in, you all might have seen that there were tide predictions for the area, and you may have taken them as real-time readings. In the 1970s, there was a tide gauge in place here. I believe it was in place for 2 years, and it took readings every 15 minutes, the same as this current system does, and would report them back to NOAA. NOAA has then used those readings from 2 years, again, back in the 70s, to determine what predictions for tides we have now. So the lack of real-time readings has made it difficult from a planning and decision-making standpoint, at least in my opinion and in my modeling, to make proper decisions when we have a lack of tidal information. I think that with having this in place, not only do we gain a better understanding of what our normal tidal fluctuation looks like on the island, but we have the opportunity to develop our own tidal datums to better help engineering and planning for projects in the future. Those do take a while. They take about 20 years before you have a new tidal epic. But at this point, we've got it in, we're receiving data, and we're able to go ahead and make calculations based on those datums to determine how much sea level rise we have seen in the past 30 years since the original gauge has been put into place. So a little bit more about this gauge. What I've got here is actually a map with some data from NOAA. All of these points on the map are major tide gauges around South Carolina's coast, and then somewhat up into North Carolina as well. But if you'll see here on the screen, we've got the major gauge in the city of Charleston on the Cooper River, which is what they were using with the data that we had collected in the 70s down by the Kiawah River to create predictions for our area. So there is different tidal variation, although it is slight between Kiawah and the city of Charleston. They were using old data from our area combined with Charleston specific data to create a calculation for what tides we were predicted that day. And I will say they are fairly accurate despite that fact. And I'll show that to you here in a second with some of the readings that I have. But I think the bigger point to make here is that there is a huge gap in data between the city of Charleston and Fort Pulaski in Georgia. So this gap in information makes it difficult to make predictions from one area to another. Each gauge is also used to help better the tidal datums in our area so that planners and engineers know what heights to build roads, and the same for just development in general. By having another point local to us, we can then triangulate between these 3 gauges to get a better idea of what our tidal surface layer actually looks like, if you will. And then that's also in conjunction with another tide gauge that is in Ocean Park that I'll also discuss here in a second. So here is, and maybe some of you have seen this already as well, this is the public webpage that hosts the data from the tide gauge at the Kiawah River Bridge. I believe it's hosted both on KICA's website and the town's website. And you've also got a weather station output here as well. And this station is located actually on timbers. So the tide readings you see here, the blue line is your actual real-time reading that's collected every 15 minutes. And then you've also got your predictions, which are here in black. So before, these predictions, again, were what we were using as an island and taking them at face value. So when you see here that we're a couple feet off, you know, in this scenario specifically for this week or so of tides, we're not having any tides that were higher than predicted, but often we do. And what changes that make that happen are usually local weather. Wind is a huge driver for a variation outside of what was predicted for our area. And normally it's those winds that are coming from the northwest. So anything that's coming down the Keele River is going to push water up onto the island as well. And oftentimes during the winter, when we have higher winds, we'll see those tides exceed what was predicted by a fair amount. But again, here you're seeing a lot of the tides actually are lower than what has been predicted in the past. So here is an output, and one of the additional sort of justifications for having this tide gauge is not just for taking these continuous measurements and storing historical data, but it's also looking at how those tides affect us as a community. So this red line that you see dotted across the image that just popped up is actually the elevation of Kiawah Island Parkway. And this is the low point on the Parkway before you get to the main gate. So it was perfect that I was engaged with the town on their resurfacing project beforehand, because I had access to the surveys. And all I was able to do was plug that exact value in, lowest point on the road, and it becomes sort of a threshold value for us. So you can see here how close, and I believe this was September of last year when we had those extremely high tides. And you can see how close the tides actually got to that threshold value of the Parkway. And what we had originally envisioned this to be used for is, if a resident is off the island or has left for an evacuation, they can know when water levels have receded to the point where they can now access the island again. So again, just another use for this tide gauge in regard to emergency management. And then here I have actually the output that you'll find on one of the additional outputs you'll find from the National Weather Service. So by us installing this gauge ourselves and then coordinating with the College of Charleston to host the data for us, we've entered the Weather Ready Nation Ambassador Program with the National Weather Service. And again, what that does is it gives us better access to the Weather Service's products. And they actually go through and catalog and QA/QC the data that we're outputting. So on the left here, you'll see that they have kept track of our historic crests. So this is just historic high tides, and then also recent ones. Now these have changed recently, I believe, but again, these are from last year. And you can see that those September, October months are, again, during the winter when we receive those winds and tides are higher than normal. And you can see there we've gotten pretty close to 9 foot, which is just up at the Parkway. And the second gauge that I mentioned at Ocean Park, you'll notice that this one is much smaller. This is part of actually a South Carolina Beach Advocates driven collaboration between Kiawah Island, Seabrook Island, the Isle of Palms, Sullivan's Island, Devereux Colony, and I'm probably miss Edisto Beach as well. All of those communities were given these small gauges that you see here, and we've got it installed in a box. But essentially, this is just a PVC pipe with the same components, just smaller scale as the gauge that was put on the Kiawah River Bridge. And the company that makes this is actually based out of the University of Hawaii. So I'm still waiting to troubleshoot and have to take a quick trip to Hawaii to visit their little manufacturing process, but hasn't happened yet. And actually, we've had a lot of great luck with this tide gauge. The readings I've compared them with what we've seen at the Kiawah River Bridge, and there's a slight bit more amount of noise that are coming from this unit than others, but it could very well be the location of this gauge. It's actually on Bass Creek. And it could be the boat traffic coming in and out. It could be fishermen. Anything that will make its way under the unit here will actually cause a blip in the readings. But it takes the same sampling time frame, about every 15 minutes, and it's to the millimeter accurate. So both of these systems have the ability to showcase sea level rise at an extremely fine scale. You need the millimeter scale. At this point, I think the city has reported around 3 millimeters per year in sea level rise that they're seeing. So this is just something that you need to have if you're really focused on looking at sea level trends. But as I mentioned, with all of these communities adopting these small tide gauges, we are given essentially a small scale version, central to South Carolina, of NOAA's actual network. So NOAA has a network of tide gauges that are extremely high level, that require surveying from year to year. They require what's called redundancy, so they have to have different multiple water level measuring devices in one location. Which was extremely, it's extremely expensive and time consuming endeavor to maintain. So what we decided to do in collaboration with these other communities was to create our own network. So instead of, and actually in conjunction with the tidal information that NOAA is putting out, all these communities are collecting their own, and we get a better prediction of sea level rise if we have that chain of consistent readings all of the time. So it's a very exciting project. It's still in the early stages, which is why the data hasn't been released to the community yet, but it certainly will be in the next year or so. The goal for this tide gauge is actually to create a application for your cell phone or your tablet, so that you can go on and get these tidal values straight to your phone if you would like. And again, it's not only restricting you to looking at Kiawah's tide gauge, you can go and look at Isle of Palms and what their tides are looking like. And same goes for all the other communities that I had named before. So this is a very exciting project to me. And again, here's sort of what the app will look like. This is what the current website looks like for this device as of now. You can see some of that noise I was talking about in here, where we've got these jumps in data, which aren't a huge problem, but it's something that I'm hoping that we can work out with the developer before we do release it to the community. But again, the data isn't horrible. You can see the trends very easily, and it's just a matter of removing these sort of outliers from the overall data before comparing them with the Kiawah River Bridge. But it's certainly exciting. There is the potential to essentially purchase more of these, and I think it could be a great way to monitor water levels in the tidal creeks. I did notice that it seems like the Ocean Park area does receive high tide about 10 minutes sooner than the Kiawah River Bridge. And that could be because of a multitude of factors, but again, having that location is a great resource for us, and it's also on one of the major outfalls on the island as well. So we can see how rainfall and drainage from the island affects the water levels in that tidal creek. So hopefully more to come soon on the Hohanu tide gauge. Oh, and then I did include a graphic here. This is probably extremely hard to see because it is a lot of data. This is a month's worth of tidal data. And I've overlaid the readings from the Hohanu and from the Kiawah River Bridge on top of each other. So the Hohanu, the smaller gauge, is in blue, and the green is the Kiawah River Bridge. And you can see that the bridge usually has a bigger tidal swing than the tidal creek, which, I mean, I believe it makes sense. The tidal swing could be due to, you know, a multitude of factors. But to me, I believe that the size of that, the river itself is probably the major factor for these larger tidal swings. So the next monitoring that's been put into place is actually a Conservancy endeavor. And this is the groundwater monitoring project that they've been working on recently. And what I believe has been done to this point is there's maybe around 25 to 30 different wells around the island. And I'm sure Lee will talk about that later on if there's any questions about it. But this is our sort of opportunity to gauge what the what groundwater levels look like on the island, which is something that has been missing for a long time and was a direct recommendation in the sea level rise report. Not only water level, but what does the freshwater lens look like on the island? And at what point are we, you know, at what point towards the perimeter of the island are we seeing saltwater intrusion? So I believe that there's a lot to come from this project. I don't believe it's just water levels. I believe that that there's the potential to look at how groundwater moves throughout the island and how it relates to the pond system. A lot of our ponds are not lined. So when we raise or lower them, there's absolutely an effect to the groundwater table. And having these wells in and having them in at the same time that we've got the tide gauges, we can actually see how tides affect the groundwater table and rainfall events with the several different weather stations that we've got installed on the island as well. And it's actually extremely interesting. Here's just a sample of some information that was sent to DNR, which was just a time series regression where we compared 3 different variables, which were the groundwater level, rainfall, and tides. We originally had salinity in here as well, but the data on their end was fairly inconsistent. So I just chose to show you the 2 plots for rainfall and tides. And it was a very interesting conversation, which I had with the folks at DNR. But the ultimate results that they had found was that yesterday's tide, so the tide the day before, and rainfall with a 13.5 hour were the biggest or had the most relation to water levels in the groundwater system. So what that means to me is that if we've got a high tide the day before a rainfall event, we're likely to see a spike in groundwater in the water table, which is probably explanatory of why a series of rainfall events and saturated ground tend to hold water above the surface, and we get sort of spotty areas of flooding, you know, on properties or on in the forest around the island. And then the second one that I find maybe more interesting is the 13.5 hour lag time between a rainfall event and then the spike of a high tide. Being that this data was only for about a month's time frame, it'd be very interesting to redo all of this after having a year's worth of data and seeing if we get the same result. my best sort of theory for why there is that 13.5-hour lag is probably something to do with storage in the pond system. So the immediate rainfall would have run off into the pond above ground. But then obviously those ponds feed our groundwater system. So that 13.5-hour lag could very well be the rainfall filling the ponds and then the ponds slowly distributing that rain into the groundwater system. So there's still a lot to learn here, but I do think that there's tons of great information to be had. The second project that the Conservancy is working on now, that again is directly related to recommendations from the sea level rise adaptation report, is a marsh vulnerability assessment. And I included only one image here because I think there's so much to dive into with marsh vulnerability that I think it's better for folks to explore it on their own. But I did include, and I believe this link will be made public, but I can go into it now. This is actually a link for UVVR. I believe you all should be able to see that. But this is the USGS's portal for unvegetated and vegetated ratios. So you can see the different products that they have. I believe this is actually a product that the Conservancy is looking at getting worked out on Kiawah Island. But one of their categories is salt marsh vulnerability. And let's see here. I'll go into one area. We can go into Plum Island.
Quick, you think you're still screen sharing on the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Oh, am I? Okay. 1 second.
There you go.
Perfect. So we'll go up here to the north, Boston. So this is what the ultimate product from UVVR looks like. If I can get it to focus in, which is a modeling of colors that you'll see in the marsh. And these different colors represent the different levels of vegetated to unvegetated ratios in these plots of land. So as you go through here, you'll see that there are some zones that are red. These are areas where there is less vegetation than vegetation, just in the simplest of terms. And it's a great way to look at what areas in the marsh are being, maybe it's continually inundated, or maybe there's just a higher salinity in the area that aren't allowing the marsh grasses to grow. It's a great way to look at an overall quick glance at the marsh and determine areas that may be of concern in the future, and to spot sort of on the ground monitoring, which, you know, I'm very excited to see this come out, and I believe it feeds very well into the resilience plan. So I just wanted to give you all a quick look at that. Again, this is a Conservancy project, so I believe that they'll probably have a lot more information than I do at this point in time. But I think it's extremely interesting and definitely worthwhile mentioning. So let me switch back to the PowerPoint. And then the final section here are future projects. Both of these are actually currently in the workings. So the first here, I've got information from a grant that was received by the Conservancy again. And I've been lucky enough to be asked to be a part of this in the form of a collaboration between the Conservancy and Kiawah to use informed scenario planning for community-wide resilience building on Kiawah Island. And the mode that we've taken with this project so far has been engaging with the different entities on the island and those that manage within those entities, and how we might improve or introduce more green infrastructure and low impact development to the island. Just as a way to add another sort of response to our toolkit. I believe that there's a lot, again, that speaks to adaptive management and the resilience plan that comes out of this, this effort. At this point, Lee and I have completed phase 1, I would say, most of the way, Lee, which was just speaking with the other island entities and seeing what ways low impact development has been used on the island in the past, and what might be some projects that would be worthwhile attacking now. And, you know, furthermore, what would be accepted as a means of getting these projects done? Is it more information? Is it more communication about what the projects look like? That's our overall goal in determining what, you know, what does our community need in order to promote these projects? And then I did include a couple images here of what some of those projects might look like. The top left, this is a rain garden or bioswale. There's many terms for them, but it's certainly something that Lee and I have been investigating a lot recently, and really just the ability to expand the stormwater system beyond pipes and ponds. What are ways that we can store water on KICA properties and allow that water to infiltrate and replenish the groundwater system, and also keep that stormwater out of the drainage network. The less water that's in the network, the less likely that that system could back up. So I think that this is a extremely interesting endeavor, and it's definitely been promoted by recent Dutch dialogues, and then the city of Charleston has a whole program around this as well. So it's something that we decided we would look into as well. And then on the bottom right here is an example of an oyster sill, which is it's a sort of an erosion control and shoreline structuring device that just consists of almost a wall of oysters with a planted area behind it. And these actually act to trap sediment along with the marsh grasses themselves and to help shore up the shoreline over time. So I'm hoping that these could be potential solutions to approach in the future that are low impact, and I believe provide some aesthetic appeal as well, certainly over a bulkhead or additional drainage, but more creative ways to manage stormwater. And then here I've got my current project that I'm working on now. So I mentioned earlier the original adaptive management resilience plan phase 1 report, and this red area that's circled here is what I'm sort of diving into now. So I was given a list from the community of their concerns, and my goal for this next phase was to be able to define you know, what a worst case scenario for something like the road is. And then furthermore, what trigger points lead up to that scenario taking place are there? And then moreover, how do you monitor for those impacts? And at what point do you make a call that you add funding to a project, or do you know, is the response just to provide additional monitoring resources? And that's what I'm working on now. So I've got a sort of a quick example of this here. This has been one of the more, let's see if I can go back. One of the more, I guess the word would be one of the easier thresholds, especially in respect to something that's man-made rather than something that's natural, like the salt marsh, that's much more complex. But roads are something that I think are highly regarded on the island, and definitely something that we all look at when there's a storm surge, or when we know tides are going to be high, or when there's an increased amount of rainfall. What is it that we're looking for? We're ultimately, the worst case scenario for our roads were for them to be impassable. So more than 12 inches of water on the roadway. And then again, well, if we use 12 inches as an identifier, we may have a situation where the road is still flooded under that amount, but both lanes are flooded. And this all stems from actually from definitions from DOT on what a flooded road is. So we needed a way to determine what a worst case scenario is and to define sort of a problem that we're looking for, which was our indicator. The next point was to establish some sort of trigger for action. And here, that's an impassable road for more than 4 hours of time, which is your tidal cycle. If there is a road that's inundated for more than 4 hours, then we know it's likely not just the tide causing an issue. It's more of it's probably either a clogged drain or the area is just too low in elevation and needs to be reconstructed. And then again, roads are impassable more than once a year. This is something that I believe would initiate an additional monitoring study, maybe not an immediate fix to the problem, but just to determine, is it pine straw that's clogging the system? Is it, did we have an uncharacteristic storm for the year? Things of that nature. And with the projects that we had put into place through the Water Management Task Force, we had determined that a 25-year rainfall event wouldn't cause an issue on the island as far as we had predicted. So something that would cause a trigger at this point in time would be extremely uncharacteristic for what we've seen in the past. So again, the parameters that we're looking at for this specific threshold are rainfall totals for the island. There are also water levels at the Kiawah River Bridge, and then the flood reports that you all send us. And that is through the KICA webpage. If you haven't seen those already, it is a great way for you to communicate when you do see flooding on the island and to make us aware of it so that we can go in and fix that issue. It's also important for tracking for me and validating some of the models I had. So if you ever see flooding, I do encourage you to go and report that to us. It's a great tool for us to learn. And then again, I have in here a monitoring schedule, which is just a visual monitoring during these storms, which is something that we do already. If we know that there's a tide coming in that day or a big rainfall event that we're predicted to have, oftentimes we'll navigate the island just to see what areas are flooded and what are not. And then even when myself, if I'm not on the island, our security team does this as well. They'll regularly put out signage or cones to direct traffic, and then they also send me a report so I know which roads were impassable and when. And then again, an annual review of the property owner flood reports, and then ongoing modeling. So as more data is released, as new elevation models are created and LIDAR is flown by the Department of Natural Resources, as our tidal readings and our understanding of tides around Kiawah develops, and as we move into the future and your 1-year rainfall event, or sorry, your 2-year rainfall event slowly becomes your 1, as the frequency and intensity of storms sort of picks up, then we'll be able to capture that and reassess our ability to remain resilient to those types of events. And then again, all those flood reports are always compared to the data that we received that day so that we can make a determination, well, was that report more than likely related to a higher tide that day, or was it related to the rainfall event that we may or may not have had? And then finally, at the end, we do have an entity, an individual responsible for each of these sections. So in the future, not all of these thresholds that I'm developing will be applicable to KICA. So part of this whole process is determining what entity plays a role in each of these projects and how we might collaborate in the future. So with that, I believe that's the end of my presentation. So I'm happy to take any questions that you all might have.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Dick Wilderman. I live on Seabrook Island. You mentioned at one point about when you were discussing the smaller tide gauges, that a number of other communities have them. You mentioned Seabrook. Is it the town of Seabrook Island that you work with, or the Property Owners Association?
It's all of my work has been through Steve Hirsch. Steve is
Oh.
a member of
Yeah, I know Steve.
the South Carolina Beach Advocates. So he was approached and he is on the team. And I think Steve and I were the first ones to receive these gauges. So Seabrook does have this.
Okay.
Don't know exactly where he's put it in.
Yep.
But he is on this as well. And you know, as the website gets you know, as it becomes better, I guess is the better way to say, as the website becomes better and as they develop the actual app for residents, a lot of this will get rolled out. So you should see it very soon.
Okay, thanks. I'll ask Steve. I know him, so I'll ask where it is.
Okay.
I'd be curious.
Other questions?
If there's any other questions, feel free to either speak up or throw them in the chat.
Question. So you were talking about the monitors that you have out and the noise that one of them was catching. So how exactly do those monitors work?
Sure.
And
So
how would their noise? Okay.
let me go back to that. That's a great. And it's probably explained better if I look at this one here. So this here is essentially just the computer associated with the tide gauge. This component here is just the antenna. So the difference between this tide gauge and the other one is that this gauge has the ability to communicate via cellular connection and satellite connection both. So if cellular were to go down, we would still be collecting water levels because of the connection to a satellite, which is actually great for a major storm event and something that I forgot to mention. But the gauge itself is actually right here, the sensor. So this cone at the end is a microwave radar sensor. So essentially every 15 minutes, it sends out a pulse of sound that will bounce off the surface of the water and then back into the cone. And the system knows the exact height of the bottom of this cone so that it can calculate the distance from water to the surface of, or from the water surface to the cone itself. And that's how those sensors work. So if anything were to fly under this at the right time, it would ping that item or that boat or that individual, and I would get noise. Another cause could be a big wave. Normally with this type of system, the waves will be sort of factored out by the system itself, but with the other, it's not as a complex of a system. So there needs to be some way for me to remove that noise myself. But I have seen regularly, sometimes we'll have a reading that's like 10 foot higher than the water holes surrounding. And the only thing I can imagine it being is a bird flying under it or something of that nature. Just timing is everything with them. But great question. They are microwave radar sensors.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Any other questions? Well, I do have one. What are some of the top things that residents of Kiawah and the surrounding areas can kind of do to help build the resilience and help kind of get involved with this sort of thing?
Sure. I think reaching out is a big one. One of the, I do get a lot of calls from homeowners all the time that have issues on their property and want to better understand the system itself. So I always encourage folks to reach out to me. I encourage you to apply. You know, maybe it's review from the ARB. You know, there's materials that KICA has out as well on rain gardens. If that's something that you're interested in, you know, there is currently a review process for them, but you can go through. We've got a brochure out that folks can look at. We've got links to the Carolina Yards database if you're looking for native plantings. I'm sure there's more that the Conservancy has as well. But if you've got a concern on your property, I encourage you to reach out. I think the best thing that property owners can do is to get a better understanding of what other folks have done, and just ensure that whatever project that you put on your own property doesn't affect a neighboring lot. I think that that there's a lot to be said about, you know, making yourself informed, and if there's a bunch of resources on the island, so if you've got questions, feel free to reach out. So yeah.